Okay, so we're all still kind of processing this whole re-election thing, right?
Absolutely.
But what we're going to try to do today is like dive deep into what this actually means for your wallet, like the real nitty-gritty economic stuff.
Right, because it's not just about the headlines, it's about how those headlines actually trickle down and impact your daily life and your investments and all that.
Exactly. So we've been combing through some pretty insightful reports, and let me tell you, it's a mixed bag. Trump being back in the Oval Office is sparking some serious debate about where the economy is headed next,
Yeah, a lot of moving parts here.
for sure. But for this deep dive, we're going to try to zero in on a few key areas that we think are going to be like the most impactful.
Yeah.
We're talking investor sentiment, those tricky regulatory changes, who he picks for his cabinet, whether all this M&A talk is going to pan out, and of course, what's going to happen with the Fed.
It's really fascinating how each of these pieces kind of fits together.
Totally. Okay, so first up, investor sentiment. A lot of the reports are saying investors are looking for like more clarity on policies now that the election is settled, which on the surface sounds like a good thing.
Right, like, finally, we know what to expect.
Exactly. But, and this is where it gets interesting, this clarity could actually end up costing us. I mean, like literally costing us in the form of higher prices.
Yeah, see, when investors feel uncertain, they tend to hold back a bit.
Right. They don't want to make big moves if they don't know what the rules of the game are.
Exactly. But once things become clear, that can lead to a surge in spending and investment, which, classic Econ 101, can fuel inflation.
And inflation equals.
Higher prices for pretty much everything. Could be your groceries, could be that new car you're saving up for, could even impact your rent.
So basically, the source is saying that this whole clarity thing that investors are craving could actually end up hitting our wallets pretty hard.
That's one possible outcome, yeah. And the reports specifically point to tariffs as a major factor here. Like, if Trump doubles down on his America First trade policies, those tariffs on imported goods, they're going to drive up costs for businesses, and guess who ends up footing the bill?
Us, the consumers.
Bingo. And it's not just about individual products getting more expensive. Inflation eats away at your purchasing power overall.
Oh.
So even if your salary stays the same, you're effectively able to buy less with it because everything costs more.
Okay, so that's inflation.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something to keep an eye on. But then there's this whole other beast, which is deregulation.
Right.
Our source is highlighting how the courts, especially with the new appointments Trump will be making, could throw a wrench in the works, making things pretty volatile for businesses, especially in the coming quarters.
Yeah, the legal landscape is always shifting, and court decisions can have a huge ripple effect, especially on specific industries.
Like, can you give an example of how this might play out in the real world, like for our listeners?
Sure. Let's say you're following the renewable energy sector. There's a lot of debate around environmental regulations, and court rulings on those regulations could make things super unpredictable for companies like, I don't know, First Solar or Tesla, for example.
Oh, right, because those companies are heavily dependent on government policies, incentives, all that stuff.
Exactly. So if a court strikes down a key regulation, that could mean delays in projects, shifts in investment strategies, and ultimately it could impact their stock value. And of course, that ripples out to anyone who's invested in those companies.
So it's not just about the companies themselves, it's about the entire ecosystem around them. The investors, the workers, the consumers who rely on their products and services.
Absolutely. And this uncertainty can make it really hard for businesses to plan for the future. They're kind of left in limbo, waiting to see how the legal battles play out.
Which brings us to another huge factor, who Trump appoints to his cabinet.
Right, especially positions like Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State.
Yeah, because those are the folks who are basically calling the shots on international economic policy, right?
Absolutely. We're talking trade agreements, tariffs, sanctions, foreign aid, all that stuff. These decisions have massive implications for global markets.
And it's not just like theoretical global markets.
No, it's your 401k, your mutual funds, potentially even the price of your morning coffee, depending on where those beans are imported from.
So, yeah, definitely keep an eye on who gets tapped for those key positions.
For sure.
Okay, now on to something a little more, I guess, exciting. All this talk about a potential surge in mergers and acquisitions. The report actually uses the phrase stronger economy as a possible driver for this.
Yeah. There's a school of thought that a strong economy actually encourages M&A activity.
Right, because companies have more cash on hand, they're feeling confident, and they're looking to expand.
Exactly. But we also have to consider how the regulatory landscape might change under Trump's second term. If we see a more relaxed approach to antitrust laws, that could incentivize businesses to consolidate even more.
So instead of like healthy competition between a bunch of different companies, we might see a few big players gobbling up the smaller ones.
Potentially, yeah. And that can have major implications for consumers. Less competition often means higher prices and fewer choices.
Right. And we've seen this play out in like the airline industry, the healthcare industry.
Exactly. So if this M&A wave does materialize, it'll be interesting to see which industries are most affected and how it ultimately impacts consumers.
Definitely something to watch.
Yeah.
Okay, now, last but not least, the big one,
Hmm.
the Federal Reserve. There's been a ton of speculation about whether Trump might try to exert more control over the Fed this time around, but our source seems to think that its independence will probably remain intact.
Which is good news, because that independence allows the Fed to make decisions based on what's best for the economy without being swayed by political pressure.
Yeah, they can kind of just focus on the data, on inflation, on interest rates, all that stuff.
Exactly. And that stability is crucial for maintaining confidence in the financial system. When investors trust that the Fed is acting in a responsible, independent way, they're more likely to invest, which ultimately drives economic growth.
So basically, the Fed's independence is kind of like the bedrock upon which everything else is built.
You could say that, yeah. It's a key ingredient for a healthy economy.
So, wow, we just covered a ton of ground. But if we had to sum it all up, what would you say is the big takeaway for our listeners? Like, what should they be paying attention to in the coming months and years?
Well, I think it's clear that Trump's reelection is going to bring both opportunities and challenges for the economy.
Right. It's not all doom and gloom, but it's not all sunshine and rainbows either.
Exactly. And while our sources do suggest a cautious approach to investing, especially in the short term, they also acknowledge the potential for growth and change. So I'd say the key is to stay informed, keep an eye on how these trends are developing, and think about how they might specifically impact your financial decisions and the industries you're invested in.
And honestly, who knows what's going to happen, right? I mean, this is all just speculation based on what we know right now.
That's the fun part. We get to watch it all unfold.
And try to make some smart decisions along the way. Well, thanks for breaking all this down for us.
Anytime.
And to our listeners, as always, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, knowledge is power, especially when it comes to your money. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.
See you then.